pretty much been spending the last 7 to 8 years, as Stéphane and Louis said, mentoring young entrepreneurs, creating entrepreneur forums, speaking about entrepreneurship. And what I really like about this forum here is that you guys, and again, kudos to you, you actually invited African entrepreneurs to experience this moment. You know, usually it's always the same 10, 15 people, and we meet at different conferences everywhere. And there's a lot of cheerleading when we're very happy, when we're encouraging people, but we don't actually get to share and hear from the young entrepreneurs from the continent. So I want to applaud the ones who were able to come here. So big round of applause to the young entrepreneurs. But really, you know, my bio was very trace focused, but trace is really very much part of my past now. Even though I did it for 15 years, my focus now is True Africa. And True Africa is a media platform that we created. Fleur McDonald, our features editor, who really is more of an executive editor, is here on the front row. So I'm shouting out all the people who've been part of this wonderful journey. But True Africa, we created as a platform to empower young African voices. So the reason we created it and launched it in September 2015 was that we felt that we needed to hear from real African voices from the continent, as well as from the African diaspora. So we publish stories about music, about film, fashion, entrepreneurship, and just almost as a barometer for how the continent is feeling about youth and about its future. So from a business perspective, it made sense, right? I mean, this is Bloomberg Intelligence right here, and it's very, very clear that the rise of mobile broadband and connectivity will increase partnerships between big telcos and also content providers like True Africa going forward. So it makes sense. But once you know that, how do you actually make it happen? In our case, because I've been a media entrepreneur my whole life, I said, well, why don't we try to find the people who are the real change agents on the ground, and why don't we give them a voice? Why don't we get them produce short videos? Why don't we get them to write short articles, even if we have to edit them? And ultimately, how about training them to become uh, journalists themselves, even people who never actually saw themselves as journalists? And that's because if you really look at the demographics, I know you've seen these numbers a million times, when you have 60% of the entire population of the African continent that is under the age of 24, then you realize that it's very real. And again, I don't think I've been to a conference in the last 3 years where I haven't actually given this factoid. There's more children born in Nigeria every year than in the entire European Union. So in that single country, Nigeria, you have more children born every year than the entire European Union. So it's a huge market. There is pent-up demand. And the problem, though, is that it's usually always about Nigeria, it's always about South Africa, and it's always about Kenya. So with these kind of insights, I said, well, why don't I do something for some of the underserved markets that I know really well? So then in 2013, I decided to create a forum of young entrepreneurs in Togo. This is actually a team that is in Johannesburg, in Bramford team, that is basically writing for True Africa. But I wanted to go back to Togo because we look at these hubs. You know, we're in between New York and London, and we're opening an office in Johannesburg, and obviously Lagos and Nairobi, as I said previously. But going forward, I said, well, it's also time to look at some of the underserved markets, because what I noticed is that a lot of the innovation, to use the buzzword, actually comes from the major English-speaking countries that we mentioned previously. So I said, why don't we go back to Togo, which is a very small country, 7 million people, and create a forum for young entrepreneurs. So we did that in 2013, an annual forum for young entrepreneurs, and it took off. It took off so much so that several of the winners from previous editions of the entrepreneurship competition are actually here in Marrakesh today. So the young entrepreneurs who came out of our forum became some of the most, I guess, highly regarded young innovators coming from Togo. So then with that, I realized, you know what, it's not really only about geography. It's about building an ecosystem of people who can actually support each other. Because what's happened with the Forum of Young Entrepreneurs in Togo is that there's a small community in Lomé who kind of coalesce around ideas and who motivate each other and who end up traveling together to different places, because I've always believed that in order to grow as an entrepreneur, you have to, number one, surround yourself with like-minded people who share similar values and affinities, but also you have to basically build alliances with people in other parts of the world. So in this particular case, it was really important for me to look at building alliances between young Togolese entrepreneurs, young Ghanaian entrepreneurs, young Nigerian entrepreneurs, but also some of our previous winners have gone to South Africa, have gone to Tunisia, or now here in Morocco representing Togo. So that's something that I'm very proud of. And the next edition is actually taking place on December 3rd and 4th in Lomé. So again, we're going to be nurturing the next generation of young entrepreneurs. But when I talked about frustration and when I talked about the things that were problematic, there's actually a couple of things that are really bothering me right now, and I'm going to mention them. The first one is this is one of our participants from the forum last year. So we have young entrepreneurs and we have very young future entrepreneurs as well. So then they come out of this program, they learn about building a business plan, basically identifying teams, they learn about coding, they learn about different industries, not just new technologies, but also agriculture, commerce, services. And then they come through our program and then they get picked up by various organizations. So some of them have been picked up by MIT, some of them have been picked up by the State Department through the YALI program, and they are in demand because they've actually innovated by creating something very specific to their local challenges, and it feels that certain people want to help them. So then they get invited to different places as speakers, and they get invited for, I guess, exchange programs. And some of them get to participate, and I usually always get a request to write a reference letter in order for the embassy to approve their visa. So, for instance, Sika Nabilio, she is a prodigy. She actually got her bachelor's degree when she was 16 years old, and by the time I met her, she was 17, and she participated as a candidate in the first Forum of Young Entrepreneurs in Lomé in 2013, and she won the grand prize. She won the grand prize. It was a unanimous decision, and I was head of the jury, but every single person on the jury agreed that she should be the winner. So again, there's a prodigy, somebody who represents the future of this continent. And so then she was invited to speak at this conference in North Carolina called Switchpoint. And so here I am writing a letter to the American consulate in Lomé in order for her to get a visa to go to the United States and to speak in North Carolina at the Switchpoint conference. And then I'm very hopeful because this is a grand winner, this is somebody we believe in, and then what happens? Visa application denied. She can't go, she can't travel. I write a letter, personal letter to the American ambassador in Togo, and he says he can't do anything because what happens is a lot of these young Africans who go to the United States, when they go, they never come back. They disappear, they just want to stay in the US. I said, well, we're not encouraging brain drain. We just want them to get exposure to different cultures so that they can grow as entrepreneurs as opposed to always being confined to that one specific city that they've actually never left. So somebody like Sika never traveled outside of Togo, but yet she's imagining and inventing wonderful things that could be applied to many different challenges in Africa. She created a water pump that she invented with her teammate, which again, the jury absolutely loved. Even the irony of it, the American embassy in Togo was one of the sponsors of the Forum of Young Entrepreneurs. They actually co-funded it, and yet they still wouldn't give her a visa to go and speak at a conference in North Carolina. So that was extremely frustrating. And so, but we keep pushing. Now, as Stéphane Louis said, I mentor about 30 young entrepreneurs. And then last year, I met one of the most promising young entrepreneurs that I've seen in West Africa in a long time. And we're very lucky because he's in the room with us. Alfred Ajabeng was a 2015 Mandela Washington Fellow. So does anybody here know what a Mandela Washington Fellow is? Anybody in the room? So one person. Well, Mandela Washington Fellows are basically chosen as the best and most promising young African leaders. Barack Obama created a program called YALI, which is the Young African Leaders Initiative. And every year, they bring in hundreds of young Africans who get through a training program, which could be an entrepreneurship track, it could be civil service, it could be diplomacy. It basically, the brightest young Africans who feel that they could benefit from international exposure, particularly American exposure. So Alfred Wajabeng was not only at YALI for the year 2015, but he was basically the cream of the crop of the YALIs, and those are the Mandela Washington Fellows. Those are the ones who get to travel to the United States to study at various universities, such as Berkeley, to get internships at companies like Google. And then the cherry on top of the cake is when they get to go to the White House and meet Barack Obama. And so Alfred was one of those who were fortunate enough to meet Barack Obama at the White House. as a Mandela Washington Fellow. So when I met him in 2015 in Accra, no, in 16 we met. He'd come back from his US trip, where again he learned from some wonderful entrepreneurs in Africa. He went to some great academic institutions. He got to meet Barack Obama. He came back to Ghana to basically develop his project, and he's going to come on stage to talk about his project. So what we did, because he was another winner of another entrepreneurship competition that I was involved with in Accra, I offered him an internship to come and work with us in London at the True Africa offices for 1 month. So he was going to start next week. And so he applied at the British High Commission in Accra for a visa to come and work with us. And again, I wrote a letter. I'm an established entrepreneur. I've proven myself. I'm endorsing this program. This guy has already been co-opted by the US State Department and the White House. And then what do we get last week? Visa denied, once again. So it's extremely depressing for me to realize now that we're doing all this and we're trying to work together to empower this next generation of African leaders, and yet they are not able to get the international exposure that I feel would help them to grow a lot faster, to accelerate the social change that they're about. So I want to invite Alfred on stage for a couple of minutes to talk about his experience, not complaining, because I told him it's not about complaining, it's about reapplying next year, because we're going to have to think of a new game plan for him to come and intern with us in London. But I want him to talk about the way he sees the future and the fire and passion behind his entrepreneurial venture. So you can sit here and speak for a couple of minutes, Alfred. Let's give him a round of applause, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Alfred Godwin Ajaben. About 7 years ago, after completing senior high school, I set out to make a difference in Ghana. Whilst in the university, I decided to create a non-profit organization called Reach Out to Future Leaders Movement, which spells out its purpose to reach out to future leaders for transformation of my country. I went on to develop 3 innovations: social innovation, in environmental sustainability, in agriculture for food security, and also in education. For agriculture for food security, I developed the School Farms program, a community school feeding support program that empowers local schools to be able to be food sufficient whilst using the same space to gain practical skills in agriculture. Over the 3 years that I've been in the university, I sought for a lot of opportunities to gain knowledge, experience, and opportunities and exposure, one of which was the Mandela Washington Fellowship in 2015. It was an opportunity for me to gain a lot of inspiration and aspiration to be able to impact my community and also build a future that I wanted to. Not until just last 2 weeks when I applied for visa at the UK High Commission to be able to go and do my internship with True Africa, when I was denied on unclear and unfortunate reasons. Reasons being that young entrepreneurs like us who have gone through the struggle of life with little opportunity, trying to gain the skills to build our future and our continent, are tagged as people who are looking for greener pastures, people who are just going to the UK to make money for themselves. So for us, a feeling like this discourages us, but never sets us down or never puts us away. I believe that Africa's future is in the hands of Africans. And I am determined, and I have to be able to work hard despite the discouragement, despite the challenges that I face, to build the future that I envision. And I believe that young people on the continent also are working very hard. That's also in light with Africa for Tech conference in making that happen. So Africa is on the rise and the future is happening. It is inspiring, it's full of hope, and the future is certainly Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on stage. So, it's not about complaining and it's not about whining. It is true that the odds are stacked against many Africans because, again, visa denied, the situations that we have to deal with. Even within Africa, integration, moving from one country to the other, we have to get visas to travel across Africa. This is ridiculous. I really hope that the African Union actually goes forward with this idea of an international African passport that would allow us to kind of move from country to country without having to worry about these borders. But then I'm not going to be just whining about the problematic things. I want to also talk about the people who are change makers. So last week, I was the MC at the Google Black History Month conference in London. So I've been spending a lot of time with the Google people over the last few weeks. And I got to talk to them a lot about Africa. And in the London office, there's a lot of Africans who work there, but they're British, Nigerians, British, Ghanaians. A lot of them were raised in the UK, and some of them came as immigrants. And I said, well, why don't you actually find a way, because you need so much talent and you're growing so fast, you're now the second largest company in the world, to employ or at least give internship programs to young Africans in the London office and in your various Google offices in Africa. They said, well, it's a great idea, but where do we find these young entrepreneurs? So I directed them to the Yali website. I directed them to the True Africa website where we talk about entrepreneurs. And then they came back to me and said, well, most of the people that you write about, most of the people that we've identified, they're basically all located in one city. And I said, what? So pretty much it all goes back to Lagos again. It's always about Lagos. So at events like this, it almost feels as if that Lagos is now the capital of Africa. When you talk about Africa for Tech, it's kind of coalesced around Lagos as a new center of gravity. So I want to talk about a couple of very positive experiences that I've had with Lagos entrepreneurs that deal directly with innovation and how this innovation can be globalized in the right way. So we've all heard about Andela. I was happy that Andela was so well represented at this Africa for Tech conference. It was big news for us. I remember telling Fleur, we were all very proud when on June 11th, they actually secured the funding from Mark Zuckerberg and others in their Series C round and raised $24 million. I think it was, Series B. And then they sent out this tweet on the 16th of June. To me, it wasn't just a celebration for the fact that it was a homegrown kind of Lego story that was empowered by really good New York entrepreneurs, but it was also about the fact that I have a personal connection to Andela, and I'll tell you about that later. I have a very personal and direct connection to Andela, and it's a story that I saw at its genesis, and that really gave us a lot of hope. It's this guy. So I remember meeting him when, again, he's a co-founder of Andela. He's actually now left Andela, as you probably know. He's now launching a new startup called Flutterwave, which is dealing with mobile payments. But he just told me about his dream about 4 years ago. And I remember being in a room in New York with the guy who actually became his very first investor. He was 21 years old. And he said that he wanted to change several industries in Africa. And again, he was 21 and not many people believed in him. Fast forward 4 years, he was able to help and be part of the team that successfully completed the funding from Zuckerberg. And now he's already on to his next venture. And he's even thinking a lot bigger. And what he told me when I interviewed him for the True Africa story is that he's not going to get bogged down by any one specific industry. He's just going to keep moving until he helps to solve some of the biggest challenges that we face in Africa. So Ian is somebody that I really respect, that I admire for the value that he's contributing to the future of Africa. And in a sense, moving from tech and finding different examples, different case studies of people that I've kind of helped when they were actually starting out. I want to go to this example. Looking at this is a business plan from 2011 that I reviewed and helped to improve. And this was basically the position paper that launched that business plan. Can anybody kind of guess what business actually came out of these metrics that are pretty much looking at key renewable energy and environmental challenge for Lagos? No one? No one? Yeah, I hear one guest there. Yes, recyclers. It's recyclers. Recyclers came out with this very simple diagram. You know, it's just about finding a smarter way to recycle the value chain, to scale it, and just find a way to clean the streets of Lagos by being a little bit more efficient, by being a little bit smarter, and using new technologies to do it in the best way. So again, it was a group of MIT students, and the company became active, very real, in 2012, and they've been in business now for 4 years, and they've been picking up recyclables from all kinds of different poor neighborhoods in Lagos and other parts of Nigeria. So what I really love about them is that, you know, it was the original business plan from 2011. It was launched by a young Nigerian woman called Bilike Sadebi, who, again, to me, represents the very, very best that the continent has to offer with respect to risk-taking and innovation and finding basically an opportunity to add real value to your environment. So she's a Lagos girl who was able to build this company, and that's her in the middle right there. She's the one in the middle that is, her hands are being, yeah, she's basically sending it to the guy with the glasses and the woman with the veil. And so she did it. She started with a very simple business plan, and she created this venture which is now profitable. And what I like about Recycle as an example, not just because we're gearing up for COP22 UN climate change conference here in Marrakesh, but again, she had identified a very, very simple and real problem in Lagos and was able to find a solution by innovating in the way that she approached the recycling issue. So why is it interesting to me as a case study is because with that very simple idea, she was able to find human resources and real talent and people to help her, the recyclers in Lagos, but then she was able to also identify international partners from Unilever to Echoing Green, Oracle, very large American European companies, academic institutions that gave her money and access to talent and people who could help her to grow her business. So again, a very, very simple idea, Lagos-based, that is now a successful venture run by a woman. That's the article that we published for the True Africa 100 series last year. And then, you know, obviously we all know Jumia, and I know I only have 8 minutes left, and I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions. You know, Jumia is a great example because, you know, of course, they're the most successful, I guess, internet company in Africa with the Africa Internet Group. They've raised money from Goldman Sachs. They've raised money from Orange, which is, I think, one of our sponsors here today. They've raised money from all kinds of investors in Europe, but they have pretty much applied a lot of the real learnings from distribution in the e-commerce challenge to African metropolises, and they've done it in a very, very good way, which is why I believe that even though the company is still not really profitable yet, it is set to become a very large and very important company on which many other smaller ventures can piggyback going forward. So again, it's Lagos. Lagos is the center of gravity, but here, we're here to talk about your ideas and all kinds of new ideas that are homegrown and actually that are spreading out of other cities all over Africa. So with that being said, I want to leave it with one final slide. This is a book that I bought a few years ago. It's an art book. And you know, since we talk about innovation, sometimes people forget that innovation is about the new. So when we launch these new ventures, when we pivot, when we realize that it's not growing as fast as we'd like it to, when we realize that we may need a new team, when we need to revisit the original idea, let's think of always doing new things. Because one of the challenges I face in mentoring and working with young entrepreneurs in Africa is that a lot of them want to do what somebody else has done. And when I ask them, they say, well, this person has done it successfully, so I'm just going to copy and duplicate what they did and reach the same level of success that they had. And I think that we have to change those mentalities as well and encourage people to think of things that are really, really new. And if it's not necessarily a radical innovation, then it needs to be a very smart iteration on an existing success. So I think that chase of the new is something that we can all learn from in Africa. So I want to thank you. Any questions?
Just tell me, usually when you are talking about a cluster or like a continent like Africa, you know, when you are like in the Bay Area, on the Silicon Valley, you know, they have to get focused on something like, if you said that Lagos, for example, is a center of gravity of innovation in Africa, Do you think that you should concentrate everything more or less in Lagos, so you have like the vision of Africa all around the world is like to say it's in Lagos that things happens, but they know it's in Lagos, so they take the plane, they go to Lagos and go for conferences that like Y Combinator, like whatever, like, okay? Or do you think that we should spread these kind of things all around the African continent, and maybe that they can be like a big cloud and they don't know exactly how to access to that cloud of innovation? What do you think about that?
That's a really interesting question because I've thought about that a lot myself. And actually, it's the first time I've been asked that question. And I think to answer your question in the most honest way, I do believe that we should basically rally around the Lagos ecosystem, rally around the Nairobi ecosystem, and establish as many companies there as possible. Just because they've dealt with a lot of the challenges that we face as entrepreneurs in other cities. You know, a lot of our entrepreneurs are struggling with electricity issues, are struggling with connectivity issues. Whereas in Lagos, because they've been able to attract so many repats, right? Repats or repatriates who kind of come back to work in Lagos, because they've been able to attract so much capital. So because they have great companies, consulting companies, McKinsey that gives like free service, because they have homegrown entrepreneurs, because they actually have capital, because there's more infrastructure than there are in other cities. I believe that it's better to congregate around a large metropolis like Lagos, which is close to 20 million people now, and in the same way that we could do the same in Nairobi and build it from there. But it doesn't mean that we have to get stuck there. We can work there almost like as a 2 or 3 year incubation period, and then come back to other second-tier cities and develop the businesses from there. But I believe that that training that comes from being in an environment of highly motivated people who, again, have faced very, very big challenges but have been able to find solutions in Lagos would be really beneficial to a lot of the second-tier cities in which we operate. So for instance, a lot of the young entrepreneurs in Togo, I encourage them to learn English and to actually go to Accra and go to Lagos, more importantly, to see how it's done over there, so they can come back and improve the local ecosystem by adding and what they call best practices. So that would be my advice. Any other questions?
Yeah,
I think we have 3 minutes left.
Claude, I have one question for you, if nobody else. Do you see any like difference between Eastern and Western Africa? I wouldn't say about Anglophone and Francophone Africa, but most like the West Coast and the East Coast. Do you see any like difference, and how would you frame that?
Yeah, I mean, I see more of a difference between Francophone and Anglophone than I do between East and West. I really do. I mean, I just even just being a native son of Lome, being born in Lome, which is, as I said, on the border of Ghana. So sometimes when we run out of money in Lome, we just go cross the border, go to Ghana and come back, go to the ATM over there and come back into Togo. But there is a chasm. There is a mentality issue, I find, in a lot of our French-speaking countries, and we have to talk openly about these things. A lot of the young entrepreneurs or wannabe entrepreneurs that I actually interview as part of the process of selecting the best entrepreneurs for the forum in Togo, I give them 7 minutes to convince me and the jury of 7 people, and their dream basically is to have an office with an air-conditioned office and a driver. Because that's the kind of like the French mentality of just having made it, having arrived. That is like what they aspire to. And then when I tell them that entrepreneurship sometimes is really about struggle and hard work, and when I tell them my own story about having struggled so much, having no money for the first 5 years, when I was living hand to mouth as an entrepreneur, they can't believe it. So they almost become entrepreneurs by default in a lot of the French-speaking countries. It's like there's no more government jobs, and the companies aren't hiring, so I'll become an entrepreneur by default, is what some people have actually told me. Whereas I find that in a lot of the English-speaking countries in which I operate, I find that the business mentality is much more anchored in the way that they position themselves. And it's real. And all you have to do is cross the border from Togo to Ghana, and you'll notice a difference. And the same thing, my friends, from Benin, they say the same thing. They go from Cotonou to Lagos, and they see a huge mentality difference. And I think that one thing we have to work on in a lot of our French-speaking countries is in the storytelling, how we project them into the future, and some of the role models that we present.
So why not launching True in French then?
Well, that's the next step. That's the next step. That's one of our big projects for. But what I've always done in all my media ventures, I've always started in English. Again, because I feel like you scale faster, just because there's more. That's why I could have done this presentation in French, but I prefer to do it in English because it's just, you just reach a wider audience. So I feel like once you have critical mass, then we can then launch a French edition, and I think there'll be more followers than leaders in that sense, and that's how I really feel. Ralph?
Claude, I want to ask you a question. What you're trying to do with True Life and the areas that you are making impact with it, I've been tracking and watching a site called Africa.com, which was started by a woman called Teresa Clark. She was working as the managing director of a Goldman Sachs investment subsidiary. She got really burnt out and tired, and she managed to find that the URL, Africa.com, was available. She bought it. It's now been growing, dealing with travel, design, all aspects of Africa, business. Do you see any similarity with what you're doing with True Africa and what the rise was of Africa.com?
Well, that's a great question, and it's funny you would mention Teresa Clark, because I've had, over the past 5 years, many meetings with her, at least 10 or 15 meetings about working together or merging. No, she's African American who's basically living between New York and Johannesburg. But what she'll tell you about the story of Africa.com is that, contrary to what you believe, Ralph, she actually never bought the website. She inherited it in a deal that she was working on when she was working at Goldman Sachs. She happened to stumble upon this website that happened to be available, so she actually never paid for it, right? And so she quit Goldman to basically do this as a media venture. But I think that the way we're approaching youth culture is very, very different, because she came out of an aggregation model, whereas we believe in creating original content. And I think that's how we are different. But I know Teresa very well, and I've been familiar with Africa.com since the very beginning of her story. So thank you. I'll take maybe one last question, because I have 1 minute left.
What are some of your thoughts on getting more angel investors to invest more in African startups? Are you seeing many serial entrepreneurs investing back into African startups, and what can be done to promote more serial investing?
No, I'm not. It's a great question. I'm not. That's another. I could have talked about another very problematic, very depressing thing. So I've spent a lot of time over the past 5 years talking to different investors, angel investors, venture capitalists, and various people. And what I find is a lot of people talk a good game. I myself have invested in over 20 young African companies. It might be $1,000, $2,000, $5,000 or more. And of course, when you invest in 20 companies, you may only have one or two of them that do well. But what I find with a lot of the quote-unquote so-called investors who are talking about Africa is that it's just an exploration for them. So they do these tour of tech, they go to different African countries, and they meet a bunch of entrepreneurs. But the reality is they don't actually cut a check. They meet them and they get everybody gassed up, so excited, but there's not actually that many transactions. When you really look at, the number of deal flows in Europe or America, for that matter, or Asia. And so, but now the exciting thing is there's a few people like Tijen Dam and other people. Tijen Dam left his job at Google to go to Partech Ventures and to look at investing in these kind of companies. But he's, again, a Senegalese who actually experienced it on the ground and knows what people need. But in terms of Africans looking to invest in ventures, a lot of them don't understand the risk profiles and they just don't get it. And then in terms of the foreign investors looking to invest in African ventures, there's actually very few. And so that's something that's going to have to change if we're really going to make this and get it to snowball. Thank you very much, everybody. It was a great talking to everyone.
Merci, Claude.
Thank you.